George Osborne promised that the deficit would be eliminated by 2015. He said that. A lot of people don't remember it, but he did say that, and of course it wasn't. Why? If you do austerity, then the economy does really badly. If GDP isn't going up or is even shrinking, then the debt problem's going to get worse. And that's how you get these austerity doom spirals. If Keir Starmer's staking all his hopes on growth without a coherent plan, as far as I can see, and the Tories will go back to saying, the state's too big, we need to cut the state. I've already seen articles saying, we need to do what the US is doing and just take a sledgehammer to the government. I mean, if austerity wasn't doing that already, we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that he's some kind of genius with like a grand plan. I don't think he is. I think he's like an opportunistic, egotistical money grabber who has had a few lucky breaks, including government subsidies, and now finds himself at the forefront, at the head of the government, able seemingly to act with impunity.
Cahal Moran, hello. Welcome to Politics Joe. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
Yes, very well, thanks, mate. Very well. Pleasure to have you in.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Too kind. Author of Why We're Getting Poorer, a realist guide to the economy and how we can fix it. But before we start, introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, what you do.
So I'm Cahal Moran. I currently run the YouTube channel Unlearning Economics, and that's now my full-time job. Before that, I was like an academic economist. I studied economics all the way through PhD level, and I had a job as an academic for a while, but after I discovered YouTube was a lot more fun, I decided to cross over.
What was it about academia that wasn't fun? And perhaps you maybe found a bit dry and a bit dull. Look, we're gonna, like I said, we'll talk about the book. I guess, well, top line, why are we getting poorer?
Because the economy is designed in a way that's screwing the average person over pretty badly, I would say. I think that ever since I became an adult, which is a weird way of phrasing it, but yeah.
No, I understand what you meant.
Yeah. But, my whole adult life has just been about economic crisis, and if not crisis, then at least major problem, right? Because I was about 16 when the global financial crisis hit. And since then, it's just been one thing after another: austerity, Brexit, inequality, climate change, the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
You name it, the cost of living crisis, right? So all of these things just seem to have characterized our economy for such a long time that we don't really know what a good economy feels like.
And you can only bounce between so many crises before you have to start questioning whether or not they're actually a defining aspect.
Exactly, yeah. And it's really interesting, this word crisis, because people kind of arguably abuse it now, including me, right? But it's like, this is just our economy now. And it's about time that we realize that and adjusted to it. And we can't carry on pretending that something like the pandemic, perhaps even another pandemic, isn't going to happen again. We have to actually be prepared for it. We actually have to expect it. And we have to know how to recover from it as well. Yeah.
So not only are we getting poorer, I think it's 2023 Bank of England economist Hugh Pill says that Brits actually need to accept that they are poorer.
Yes.
Is that true? Do we need to accept it?
Yes, that's a slightly different way of looking at what I just said, right? That's a bit more of an austere way of saying it. Yeah. I think what I'm saying is that, something more like the early atmosphere of togetherness and support at the beginning of the pandemic, perhaps. That's what I would want. That things like taking care of essential workers, for instance, who we realized are essential in the pandemic and then obviously quickly forgot about that, right? But actually taking care of those people, so providing support to people in need, properly funding public services, all the kind of fairly classic, standard, good stuff. But I think Hugh Pill was more along the lines of, this is the way it is, and you just got to accept that your paycheck's declining, public services are declining, and we're never going to value you.
Yeah, stagnant wages, inflation. Welcome to Britain. Accept it. Yeah, and the interesting thing for me, I guess, that's like quite a frank, maybe even too honest statement, right? Because at least political figures will, they'll try to give you a plan. They'll quite often have the same diagnosis, particularly if it's around an election and they're not an incumbent. They'll say, this isn't good enough, it has to change, and I'm the candidate that can change it. And it might be because we're going to grow the economy. Other political figures might say it's because we're going to attempt to redistribute some wealth and address wealth inequality. The buzzword, obviously, in recent times has been growth, and that's the way that Keir Starmer has approached being in government. It's the way Liz Truss approached being in government. But there are you don't just have to accept it, right? Like you can imagine. You don't even have to settle for growth, right? You could imagine an alternate reality. You could imagine a world in which the economy was organised differently.
And I think that's one of the aims of the book, right?
Yeah.
And it's, you know, to pair imagination and the anti-Hugh Pill view. He's catching a lot of flack now. He did apologise for his comments.
Anti-pill,
anti-pill, the anti-pill, exactly. But like you can pair some imagination with economic analysis and a willingness to understand the economy and know that, okay, yeah, you can't just magic up a perfect economy out of thin air. You actually do have to like design policy properly and design it well. But at the same time, there are so many readily available examples. And one I use in the book early on is Germany, right? Germany have much more labor-friendly laws and policies. They have low regional inequality. In the UK, we've got really terrible, awful regional inequality. Outside of London, we're a very poor country. In Germany, it's not so much like that. You have good work and industry across the entire country. Germany has much lower inequality in general, not just regional. And, you know, all of these things, Germany's not some kind of utopia. It's not perfect by any means, but you only have to look, you know, across to continental Europe to see that other things are possible.
What would you make of Starmer's plan? And I guess more broadly, you could start with growth. Like, as that buzzword that multiple people of different political persuasions have identified as the kind of catch-all to solve our problems. For you, is growth important? Can it address the situation? Is there a sort of more deep-seated issue here?
I think it raises so many issues, none of which Keir Starmer is aware of, as far as I can see, but focusing on growth. I think it's a very 20th century view. Now, I wouldn't say no to some economic growth. I think for a long time you had this kind of elite pact, right? You had this, okay, inequality is rising since the 1980s. There are a few things that we don't like, but the economy is growing. The average person is better off. They're getting on the housing ladder and so on. But I think that just evaporated following the 2008 financial crisis. And we really need to rethink whether a focus on growth is enough. Firstly, because is it possible? I mean, Keir Starmer, you know, economic growth is a very difficult thing to achieve. You know, there's not like a policy you can pass or a law you can pass and growth is just higher. Otherwise, people would have done it. And I think there are other things to focus on, which are policies that directly help people, right? Policies that improve things like public services. But there's also things like pursuing technological development, right? And there's this book called The Moonshot by Mariana Mazzucato, who I don't know if you've had her on here.
We have.
Yeah, exactly. And she says, look, the Americans aimed to land on the moon. And as a side effect, there was all this great stuff, all these amazing technologies were developed, as well as them achieving their aim. And that was good for growth. And as far as I can see, she explained all this to Keir Starmer and said, you know, the moonshot should be your aim, not growth. You can't aim for growth, right? You aim for something and then you get growth. And he went away and said, okay, let's aim for growth.
Yeah. And the same actually with mission-driven government. You know, that's another one of her kind of maxims. And yeah, I've spoken to her we've interviewed her about it, and she's kind of pointed out the fallacies in some of the approaches that not just him, people when they approach trying to apply her principles, sort of take the bits that they like, which for him was like saying that he has a mission, rather than necessarily like
that is any popular economist is doomed to that. I think, unfortunately,
people slightly misunderstanding their ideas, and actually. The prevalence of economists, right, within government. You write about it, and actually there's a bit of a disconnect, right? That if you become a successful economist, you actually kind of you're no longer plugged into the economy in the way that a lot of normal people are. That gap, that distance, is that a problem? And I guess can we lay that criticism at the feet of the alleged former Bank of England employee Rachel Reeves, right? Who occupies one of the most senior positions in government. Is that a criticism you level at her?
Well, she allegedly plagiarized most of her books, so I guess like you have to be in a pretty disconnected position to do that, right? And I think, you just end up as one of the elites, right? And I don't think it's a deliberate ploy, but it seems to work quite well at insulating you. And I mean, economics as a profession has a real problem with almost any sort of demographic marker you could think of that people say, you know, in terms of representation, class, race, gender, sexuality, people with disability. You know, that's not, economics is a very white male discipline, and it's also a very middle class and upper class discipline, and a second generation academic discipline. A lot of top economists, their parents had PhDs and were economists, right? So there's a really bad disconnect to that. And I think most economists don't know what it's like to be in poverty. They don't know what it's like to be homeless, clearly. But they may not even really know what it's like to face kind of any sort of minor hardship that the average, even sort of lower middle class person will have faced. And I just think that's extremely evident from the policy. And, you know, even those who maybe have done at one point in their lives, they're lifted up into the elite and then they're in London as well. And then they're no longer connected to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess there's a couple of things we've talked about separately that I'll tie together here, which is that like financial crash happens 2008, and obviously the coalition government decided their response is going to be austerity, right? And you describe that in the book as misdiagnosis and misdirection, and there is a very real risk, I think, you know, they'll deny it, but if the Starmer government is unable to achieve growth, the consequence of that will mean public sector cuts, because taxes on wealth, or, you know, revisiting the tax system in any myriad of ways you can to sort of equalise and create a fairer tax system, don't really appear to be on the agenda. Do you think there's a risk that Starmer will make the same mistakes, as you see it and as I see it, that Cameron and Osborne made?
Yeah, I mean, people have said that this is the kind of death spiral of the UK economy, right? And to be clear, you know, growth is quite hard to achieve. I do think that austerity was bad for growth. I think that's pretty evident. I think in terms of like taking money out of the economy, taking money out of essential functions that are required for the economy, I think it's pretty straightforward that austerity was bad for growth. Now, that leads to exactly what you were talking about, right? Where you're trapped. And I mean, George Osborne promised that the deficit would be eliminated by 2015. He said that. A lot of people don't remember it, but he did say that. And of course it wasn't. Why? Because if you do austerity, then the economy does really badly. And when we talk about debt and deficit, it's as a percentage of GDP, right? So typically, you know, if GDP isn't going up or is even shrinking, then the debt problem is going to get worse. And that's how you get these austerity doom spirals. So if Keir Starmer's staking all his hopes on growth without a coherent plan, as far as I can see. I mean, they did something about we're going to allow pensions to invest their money, some like random scheme. It's like every week there's another sort of, you're like, what? You know, like that seems so minor at best and possibly will backfire. But that's also not a way to increase growth. Anyway, there's no need to get into the pension scheme. But like he doesn't really have a plan for growth. And then I think that's exactly what we're going to see. And the Tories will go back to saying, you know, the state's too big, we need to cut the state. And of course, that's now inspired by across the Atlantic Ocean. We've got this happening. I've already seen articles saying, you know, we need to do what the US is doing and just take a sledgehammer to the government. I mean, if austerity wasn't doing that already, then you know, we just really, Trump and Musk are really ramping it up. They're just cutting things off, you know, without any thought whatsoever. So that'll be taking it to the next level.
And the federal government, you know, is when. I don't mean to minimise the role that, I don't know, like the people that process universal credit claims or any other aspects of our government here. But, you know, when we're talking about the federal government in the States, we're talking about people, you know, that maintain America's nuclear arsenal and like, you know, some like insanely high level complex jobs that I think if you go in and just say we're going to aim to reduce the workforce by half, that when you take that sort of blunt level approach, you're just not going to be able to preserve the basic functions of the government, which, you know, if we're talking about X and Musk's playbook, is like, all right, fine, the app now crashes more regularly, we've lost all of our advertising revenue, but at the end of the day, nobody's died.
Yeah.
But that is, you can't say the same thing about the federal government, right? The federal government has responsibilities that extend beyond like shareholder value.
I mean, it's interesting to sort of plug the book. I do identify Musk in the book, and it was all written before the November election, right? I identify him as increasingly taking control of a number of vital public functions, and now it's never been so horrible to be proved right. He's now in the government. But
can you talk us through that? Tell me what you identified, what you saw, and then I'll follow up. But
I think I could start from the beginning, really, because I think the first thing he took control of was Tesla, right? So the electric car company that he's originally famous for, he took control of that. He didn't found it. He kind of staged a coup. He planned to take it over, and then he got a legal stipulation that he could call himself the co-founder as well, right? And that's what he took control of. And then you saw him increasingly branch out into space exploration with SpaceX, which has some achievements, but also is famous for exploding rockets and causing a lot of environmental and social damage in the areas where it launches. And then you had the boring tunnel, where he was saying, let's invent a subway, but worse, because cars go through it and they carry far fewer people. Also, there are no windows. Have you seen videos of it? There are no windows in it. It
has LED lights. Yeah.
It's horrible. Yeah. Yeah. And there's safety problems, and there are safety problems at Tesla, and employees at all of his companies, including his very first company, which was called, Zip2, have complained that he just comes in and he's like, do this, cut costs, do this. And he doesn't know how to do it. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And so he branched into all of those things. Then, of course, Twitter, right? And took control of the biggest social media platform, maybe the most influential social media platform, right? And so he's just gradually expanded his empire. And he's not the only billionaire to do that, but he does it the most loudly and egregiously, right? I mean, Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. Bernard Arnault in France, who's head of the Louis Vuitton fashion empire, has bought media in France as well. So they all kind of do it, but Musk is definitely the most offensive and the least competent, I think, as well. And now what you have is he's doing the same thing in the federal government. He's saying, I can cut costs like I thought I could at X, even though it now crashes. And he's saying that, get rid of all these regulations and stuff and everything will be fine. Now, I don't doubt that it will make him money, but it's just gross incompetence. I mean, we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that he's some kind of genius with a grand plan. I don't think he is. I think he's an opportunistic, egotistical money grabber who has had a few lucky breaks, including government subsidies, and now finds himself at the forefront, at the head of the government, able seemingly to act with impunity.
Yeah, I think, Tesla goes bankrupt without the intervention of the Obama government, right?
Yes.
So
I know. I've never been so against renewable energy, because they had that renewable energy subsidy. Yeah. If I could go back and stop Obama.
It's crazy, isn't it? His political journey, we can't get off topic here, but we'll talk about it anyway. From Obama era liberal, vocal on climate change, certainly soft on LGBT issues, to where he is now, where he's praising the far right in Germany and throwing Nazi salutes from behind a presidential pulpit in America. And so how does one lead to the other? Do you know what I mean? Is it just political opportunism? And in the same way, we've mentioned the subsidies, but SpaceX has a lot of government contracts.
Yes.
Tesla is also involved in tendering for them.
And since January as well, I think SpaceX has been awarded more, right, while they've been cutting the other government funding.
Exactly. So is it naked self-interest? Do you think he's sincere in adopting these politics? Does he do it because it's expedient and it pals him in close to Trump? What's your read?
My read is kind of rather banal, actually. I think he's just having a midlife crisis. And I honestly, I'd love to give you a really deep economic answer, but the problem is, and I think this is relevant to the book, right? Because one of the chapters is about billionaires, and one of the problems is that, even if maybe you could say in some cases incomes go up, in certain periods for certain people, that's true. That's true of the economy. It does grow over time on average, right? So in some ways we have gotten richer. I will acknowledge that. But you have these people at the top of the economy where what happens, they have so much power and control and influence. What happens to them matters to us. And I do think what happened to Elon Musk, to be honest with you, his trans daughter disowned him because he wouldn't accept her identity, which is obviously bad parenting. He then started to seemingly go through a midlife crisis, got a bit high on his own supply, took over Twitter, but people forget he didn't want to. He made a bid on a whim with a silly tweet that was something like, it was like he bid, what did he bid? Like 44.20 for the, because that's the weed number and he's really funny. Like you're 50 years old, man. You're 50 years old.
But you're right.
And then he tried. He tried to back out, right, in the Delaware court, and then they made him, right. And so I don't think there's a grand master plan. I think he's a really horrible person and a moron who finds himself in this position. Yeah, and that's the truth.
It's crazy, and I think you're right to talk about the fact that his daughter's transition and that radicalizing him. Like, also, he's on Ket.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know? You said high on his own supply, and it's he's actually high on ketamine.
No, he's actually high.
and he barely sleeps. And you're sort of, the thing that amazes me is how all of these things you look at and you go, Christ, how do you function? How are you high functioning? Because you are the richest man in the world. Because you are in these positions of tangible power and responsibility. Even more so now you're involved with the Trump administration. What I'm seeing and how dysfunctional it appears to be surely cannot be reflective of how he conducts himself privately, because how on earth would he get to the position he's in? Is like the way the suspicion I have about my own logic.
I mean, so to extend as much charity as possible to him, I think he's probably the type of guy who's pretty good at maths at school, right? He's probably got that kind of smarts in there somewhere. I mean, it might have been destroyed by the ketamine, but I think he's got that in the locker. I think he does work quite a lot. I think he works quite long hours. I think that's pretty well established. And I do think he's extremely good at raising capital. There's no way. He's really good at wooing investors. And I think what he's kind of done is he's kind of wooed the whole world in a way, right? I mean, lots of people hate him, but lots of people love him. And he's kind of done that. And he's built up this whole kind of, bullshit factor around himself where he's worth much more than he should be based on, if you look at like Tesla sales or what SpaceX have achieved, it's something, but it's not, he's got almost $500 billion in wealth. It's ridiculous. And so I think
price to earnings ratios are like so out of kilter.
Completely. Everyone knows that who's like in the market, but he just manages to ride his own bubble. I mean, people talk about what's the next bubble. I think it's just the Musk bubble. I think it's simply him, right? And if he manages to take control of the government to the extent that he wants, then maybe it will never burst, sadly, or not burst for a very long time.
One of the... So I'll backtrack slightly before I talk about inequality in the housing crisis. I don't think you could pursue the same sort of aggressive cuts program to the UK bureaucracy, government, call it whatever you want, depending on your political persuasion, because we are in a post-austerity moment. And so when the plan that's being reported in the media at the moment, that Keir Starmer is suggesting that some government departments might have to cut by as much as 11.5% from their budgets in order to fund this increase in defence spending. And you go, how on earth is that feasible? How on earth will that can it happen? Will it happen? Should it happen? I guess I would invite your criticisms, your remarks about whether or not that's the correct course of action. That's even possible.
I think, we talked about being detached. I think to come into a department, it's very management consultant, isn't it? To come into a department,
cut costs, increase profits.
Exactly. And, the only way you're going to do that, it's possible. Of course, it's possible because you can always just, fire people or close down departments. But you're going to find a major impact on the services that have been provided. And, Cambridge University released a report a couple of years ago about public service decline in the UK, and it's declining across the board. It's really unequal. It's really patchy already. And local services, I think, are the ones that have suffered the most under austerity. But we've had the doctors and nurses strike. We've had the teacher strikes, right? Teachers being underpaid and overworked. Teachers sort of... bringing food to school to feed the children. I had a friend who worked for, Teach First, the graduate scheme, and she said they were all taken aside before before they started their training, before they started their school, and told that they're not allowed to take the children home with them because, like, and I don't mean that in that way. I mean it in a, like, you're like, Jesus Christ, man, someone needs to take care of you. Like, it's gut wrenching, right? And so we're at that stage with public services. So what do you want to do next? Right? What do you want to do next? Do you want to make it even? Do you want to, like, close schools and some kids just don't go to school? Then close hospitals and some areas don't have hospitals? Because I think that's next. That has to be next. There's no other way of doing it. And, you know, I mean, 10 years ago, I would have been a sort of standard lefty and said, okay, just cut defense spending. But now I'm not even sure about that with Ukraine and Russia and everything. To be honest, I'm not sure about that either. So, there are, surely, you know, we've all dealt with the government, right? There are areas for efficiencies, but I think you're talking about things like whether filling in a form is easier. You're talking about maybe getting rid of like one or two fluffy positions, right? You can't just swoop in and be like, you know, I act like you're the first person to think of making the government more efficient. Loads of people have thought of that. And they're not going to do it. You're not going to do it the way you think.
Yeah. Why did nobody think of improving efficiencies and cutting down on fraud? How have we not come up with that idea before?
Well, it's just like David Brent, isn't it? You know, turnover, profitability.
Okay, inequality and the housing crisis, right? So we've talked about inequality and how it's driving this sort of this poorness, as perhaps the title of the book would lend itself to say.
Poorness. Sorry, it took me a second to realise what you were saying there.
It's very. Thank you for that. Talk about the housing crisis then, and how perhaps the housing crisis underpins that wealth inequality.
I think if there was one issue within, you know, the economy that captured the title "Why We're Getting Poorer," I think most people would probably talk about housing, right? Because although we as younger people do experience rises in income, right? As you know, across your 20s and 30s, you tend to experience a rise in income. I am richer just about than I was like 10 years ago. It doesn't matter shit for housing. It doesn't matter at all. The amount of money you need for a deposit, and also like the type of job you need or the hoops you need to jump through, and then the payments you'd be making, they've just gone up and up. And people are still living with randoms, 30 plus, which just is normal for us, but it's not normal, right? Yeah. It didn't happen in the past. And in the past you would have actually, bought a house and, moved in with a loved one. But all of that stuff is just being massively, massively delayed. And it seems like, house prices just keep rising and rising, and the problem isn't getting any better.
So what do we do about it?
Well, so we've been quite negative, and the title of the book sounds quite negative. I do want to make it clear that it's an optimistic book. Yeah. There's a lot of solutions, and I think nowhere more than housing. And again, there's this temptation in economics, I think, to come up with some really sophisticated sounding solution. Build more houses. Social housing, and private housing too. I think our planning system in the UK is terrible. We should probably let more private housing be built as well. I don't care. Build more houses, right? The more houses you build, the more houses are available, then people can live in them, right? That's really that simple. And, it might abate the increase in house prices. I don't think house prices are going to fall. And I think that's politically very difficult, because that's where most people's wealth is. It's where their pension is, right? So I don't think but what we can do is hopefully slow down the rise, or at least provide low cost housing as well as the houses that are rising in price, right? So that is the main thing. I just think we need to build more housing, and I think Keir Starmer did say something to the effect that he was going to do so. I'm not entirely sure what's happened there.
It's 1.5 million by the end of the Parliament, which by the estimates of most sort of policymakers that think about this, it's essentially a drop. Well, okay, 1.5 million homes is not a drop in the ocean. It's clearly a tangible, significant number, especially when you're talking about something as significant and substantial as a house.
Yes.
But there are pretty well sourced and analysed figures that say that we have a shortfall of 5 million homes in the country. So you're kind of going, Is it up to the scale of the task?
Yeah, now we have that, and that's, you've got to watch the time frame with these things, right? You know, like houses over the course of Parliament, right? Okay, well that's like 5 years, and you know, house miles like 300,000 like per year, right? And we've got a shortfall of 5 million now, so that's a fraction, right, of what we need. You know, and it's just nowhere near good enough, and it just. You know, I mean, I wish Keir Starmer had a backbone, but you just like you really have to stake out like a big policy, a big investment, and I think people like it. I don't think it's politically impossible. If you look at someone like Bernie Sanders in the USA, what was he just saying? Healthcare. He just kept saying healthcare. I think if someone who just kept saying housing, you could get that built. And, you know, with austerity, one of the points I make in the book is, you know, people say you can't afford to do it. No, you can't afford not to do it.
Yes.
You want a rise in homelessness with all of the social costs that entails, right? If you have people have like stable housing, it's so much better for everyone. And that it should be a really obvious point, but I think it's like people often just act like the economy is like a constraint on what we can do, as opposed to a reflection of a lot of activity, right? So that would be my simple solution: build more houses.
And I think that's the actual like Keynesian position on it, which is like if you can think of it, you can afford it. Like we have never been richer as a society.
Yes,
we managed to build a substantial amount of council houses in the aftermath of like a continent-destroying war.
Yes,
we can afford to do it now.
And the NHS with debt at 240% of GDP or something. And you know what happened afterwards? The post-World War II economic boom, where it was claimed, I can't remember by who, that Britons have never had it so good, right? Which is a nice contrast to Hugh Pill's statement. So, you know,
that's actually quite a nice way of tying things up, actually. Like, and how far we've fallen in the space of sort of less than 100 years, where it's like we've never had it so good, and now it's no except you are poor.
That is the art of Britain. Yes,
fucking hell. Cahal Moran, it's been an absolute pleasure having you in the studio. I'm really grateful for you coming in. Thank you. Why We're Getting Poorer: A Realist Guide to the Economy and How We Can Fix It. I would recommend it to anyone out. 13th of March, 2025. Thank you so much for coming in, mate. Really appreciate it.
It's been really fun.
Appreciate it. Thank you.